Senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, I rise today to urge my colleagues to support the Conrad-Gregg amendment. I believe the issues this amendment is designed to address, our national debt and deficits as far as the eye can see, are two of the most important issues Congress and our nation face. Our failure to address these issues will damage our economy, our nation's security, peace in the world, and the kind of future we leave to our children and grandchildren. The graveness of the issue has resulted in the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee, Senators Conrad and Gregg, coming together and introducing the Bipartisan Task Force for Responsible Fiscal Action Act, which is supported by 29 senators, 14 Democrats and 15 Republicans, and I'm pleased to say that I am one of those 15 Republicans. I think that those that follow the recent operations of the Senate will appreciate that in this balkanized Senate, where nothing seems to get done on a bipartisan basis, this commission has significant bipartisan support. The Conrad-Gregg proposal would create a statutorily based commission of 18 members, 16 members of Congress who would study the long-term fiscal imbalance of the federal government and submit recommendations as a legislative proposal that would have expedited consideration by Congress, resulting in an up or down vote. The commission would consider all options on both sides of the ledger and would require the approval of 14 of its 18 members, ensuring a bipartisan product. I want to emphasize to my Republican colleagues who may be skeptical of this bipartisan commission, half of the congressionally appointed members will be appointed by the Senate Minority Leader and the House Minority Leader, which guarantees that the Conrad-Gregg Commission will protect the concerns of my colleagues. For example, large tax increases are unlikely given the makeup and procedures of the commission. And finally, 3/5 of the Senate and 3/5 of the House must vote for passage of the recommendations, ensuring strong bipartisan support from both chambers. Now, bipartisanship is the key to success because this is not a Democratic or Republican problem. It affects everyone. And I believe this special process is the most practical and effective method to deal with the looming debt crisis that endangers the economic future of all of us. A commission to address our nation's fiscal issues has been recommended by outside budget experts from across the political spectrum. These experts have declared that the regular process is incapable of dealing with long-term fiscal issues. Just ask me. This is my 12th year in the Senate, and the regular process doesn't work. In February 2009, groups including Brookings, the Urban Institute, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, Concord Coalition, AEI, Progressive Policy Institute, and the Heritage Foundation issued a statement calling for the establishment of a commission to address our fiscal issues. Mr. President, I ask unanimous support to insert this statement in the record.
Without objection.
Recently, on PBS's nightly business program, Maya McGinnis, president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, who's been working on this problem for a dozen years, made a strong statement in support of a commission. And Mr. President, I'd like to submit her full statement for the record and would highlight that in her statement, Ms. McGinnis notes her early opposition to such a commission, but she has changed her mind based on the urgency of our nation's fiscal situation. And I ask to be Submitted to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. David Walker, President and CEO of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, former Comptroller General of the United States, has long advocated for a special process to get our nation's fiscal house in order. Mr. Walker has testified, quote, clearly escalating federal deficits and debt levels, combined with our growing dependency on foreign lenders and the deepening federal financial hole represents challenges that must be addressed. A commission could make recommendations in connection with needed statutory budget controls, social insurance programs reforms, tax reforms, additional health care reforms, and other appropriate areas. Importantly, and this is the most important thing, everything must be on the table with the commission to be credible and to have a real chance of success. End of quote. Recently, Mr. Walker released a book entitled Come Back America, Turning the Country Around and Restoring Fiscal Responsibility. In his book, Mr. Walker explains the nature of the crisis and why we must act now. Rather than describe all the frightening statistics myself, and many people have heard those statistics, I'd recommend this book to my colleagues if they have any doubts about the seriousness of this fiscal crisis facing our nation. Of course, throughout the debate on their amendment, Senators Gregg, and I heard them earlier today, and Conrad and Gregg have described eloquently the dire fiscal future our nation faces without action. I just heard another presentation from my distinguished colleague from the state of Maine. And I have, in my prior floor speeches on this topic, which probably are a dozen, described the significance of this fiscal crisis our nation faces. And for any of my colleagues or members of the public, you can access these speeches on my website. I would note that the American people agree. This is really important. The American people agree with Senators Conrad and Gregg. In fact, the latest bipartisan public opinion poll commissioned by the Peter G. Peterson Foundation this past November indicates that 80% of American voters are concerned about escalating debt and deficits. Voter concern about debt and deficits exceeded concern about health care access and affordability by 24%. By 24%. And 70% of Americans believe that the regular order in Washington is broken. They think the regular order is broken. And it's time for a fiscal reform commission to become a reality. I was pleased last year that the distinguished minority leader, the senior senator from Kentucky, spoke eloquently about the merits of the bipartisan Conrad-Gregg Commission. In a July statement on the floor, Senator McConnell said, quote, "This means that in order to face our problem head-on, we will have to address the problem of entitlement spending. And the only serious option on the table is the Conrad-Gregg proposal, which would provide a clear pathway for fixing these long-term challenges by forcing us to get debt and spending under control." He goes on to say, "I have had a number of good conversations about this proposal with the President. Based on those conversations, I'm hopeful it will be given serious attention. For the safety and security of our nation, the Conrad-Gregg proposal deserves broad bipartisan support." That was the minority leader of the United States Senate. Senator Reid has been silent on his support, but based on conversations that I've had with him, I believe he also appreciates the dire financial situation our nation faces. Still, I want to say that I've been disappointed that there has not been more of a recent effort by the leaders of both parties to embrace the Conrad-Gregg Commission, which is one of the most bipartisan pieces of legislation we have seen in the Senate during this Congress. In fact, I believe it's the most bipartisan legislation that's come before this session of Congress. My question to Senators Reid and McConnell is, if you are not in favor of the Conrad-Gregg Commission, what bipartisan proposal are you for? In other words, if you don't like the commission, then what bipartisan proposal are you for? I was also disappointed that the president initially threw in the towel on the Conrad-Gregg Commission on the grounds that he understood that the votes to pass this proposal were not there. Instead, the president proposed issuing an executive order establishing a debt commission. An executive order commission, I believe, will be looked upon by many on my side of the aisle as nothing more than an exercise in political messaging. But I say to my colleagues on this side of the aisle, if you're not for the Conrad-Gregg proposal, what are you for? What are you for? And thus I'm grateful this Saturday the president has changed his position and stated, quote, the only way to solve our long-term fiscal challenge is to solve it together, Democrats and Republicans. That's why I strongly support legislation under consideration to create a bipartisan fiscal commission to come up with a set of solutions to tackle our nation's fiscal challenges, and call on senators from both parties to vote for the creation of a statutory bipartisan fiscal commission. The President of the United States made it clear he wants this bipartisan statutory commission to pass the United States Senate. The beauty of creating the commission through legislation that it would force Congress to deal with the nation's looming fiscal catastrophe, rewarding the work of the commission members by ensuring that if their proposal gets 14 out of 18 votes, the bill will not be placed on a shelf to gather dust. I can tell you, as I've watched this Senate during the last 11 years, that if someone would ask me to sit on a commission and spend the time that I'm going to have to spend to deal with the problems that would be confronting the commission, I'd want to guarantee that if the majority, 14 out of 18 members were for it, that it would get expedited procedure and that I would get a vote up or down on that labor of work that I have participated in. I think the president understands that if we're going to respond to the fiscal crisis facing our nation, it's got to be bipartisan. And I'm prayerful that he will use his political capital with Senators Reid and Senator McConnell to secure the 60 votes needed for this landmark legislation, and then urge our House colleagues to do the same. Now, some of my colleagues have other proposals. Many of them are worthy of consideration. However, none of these proposals are bipartisan. In the end, such proposals might result in great messaging, and boy, we do a lot of messaging around here, and for some to provide a way to cover their behind, or more tactfully, Mr. President, provide a fig leaf to cover their unwillingness to cover something, to support something that is bipartisan and ultimately good for the country. And moreover, of course, these folks, would save themselves from heartburn that they might suffer when special interest groups complain and perhaps give ammunition to someone who might be running against them in a Republican or Democratic primary for the Senate. Since the possible passage of this commission has become a reality, this is really interesting how this starts to work. Special interest groups on both sides of the aisle have assailed it. Terrible, terrible. The taxpayer organization on the right warned the commission will increase taxes. And on the liberal groups on the left warned it will result in cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and other government programs. You know something? If the left and the right are so unhappy with this has got to be good legislation. Others, frankly, want to use the debt limit issue to embarrass our friends on the other side of the aisle because of the large increase we have approved, particularly as a result of the recession and the collapse of our financial markets. Other members continue to blame President Bush and earlier Congresses. The truth is, Mr. President, none of us, Republicans or Democrats, have clean hands. Since 2002, there have been nine votes to increase the debt limit, and they have occurred both under Democrats and Republicans when they controlled Congress. In that time, our debt has gone from $6.4 trillion to roughly $12.4 trillion. All of us do not have clean hands. Mr. President, the American people know that the chickens have come home to roost, and we'd better understand that. That's what I hear when I go back to Ohio. If one thing came out of Massachusetts, the people are tired of to put it in the vernacular, BS coming out of Congress. Congress numbers continue to be among the worst they've ever been because the folks back home think we're more interested in protecting our political hides and who is going to control the next Congress than working in a bipartisan way to solve our nation's problems. They know that when their elected representatives are scrapping, their interests are scraps falling off the table. They also know, as I know, that even when you work together, it is often difficult to get things done because many of us have sincere differences of opinion. I learned both of those lessons as mayor of the city of Cleveland and governor of Ohio. Mr. President, the eyes of the American people are focused on what we're doing here. The American people will be watching to see if we got the wake-up call from Massachusetts. They are telling us they are mad as hell with business as usual, and they're not going to take it anymore. The American people want us to work together. They do. They want us to work together. And they don't want messaging and backroom deals that favor one group or another. You know, Americans always hear from politicians about how they will work for bipartisan solutions to America's problems that will strengthen our future. How many times have they heard that on the floor of this Senate? Well, Mr. President, here's the opportunity for members of the Senate, the House, and President Obama to show when they make such statements, they are serious. Mr. President, I came here in 1999, and one of the major reasons I came here was to deal with paying down our nation's debt and balancing budgets. I can remember back in 2000, I was the only Republican that voted against the Republican legislation to reduce taxes because I said that money should be used to pay down debt. I'm leaving the Senate at the end of this year, as is the President. I have 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and the wife of my youngest son, Peter, is expecting their first child. I have always believed that it's my responsibility to try and leave this world, and particularly our nation, in better shape than how I found it. That was something that was ingrained in my first-generation parents. George, you have a responsibility to leave this country a better place in which you found it. I am running out of time to do something. Mr. President, so is the country. On too many occasions, Congress has been unwilling to experience short-term pain to achieve long-term gain. We have been unwilling to do without or pay for things that many folks have wanted us to do. Our nation has put the financial costs of the 2 wars on the credit card, even while the soldiers and their families continued to bear the human costs of these wars. To me, the lack of effective action is absolutely immoral. It's absolutely immoral. I recently talked to my oldest son, George, the father of 4 beautiful girls, who genuinely feels there will be no Social Security for him, that Medicare may not be there either. And he understands that the global competition facing his generation and his daughter's generation is greater than at any other time in our nation's history. The global competition is greater than at any other time in this nation's history. and that the burden that we have created because of our fiscal irresponsibility brings into question whether his children will enjoy the same opportunity for a standard of living that we have had. Mr. President, I said in the beginning of my speech, I believe the issues this amendment is designed to address, our national debt and deficits as far as the eye can see, are two of the most important issues Congress and our nation face. Our failure to address these issues will damage our economy, our nation's security, peace in the world, and the kind of future that we leave to our children and grandchildren. Mr. President, the future of our nation is in our hands. You know that? The future of our nation's in the hands of these 100 senators here. And I pray that the Holy Spirit will inspire, the Holy Spirit will come down and inspire us to make the right decision. My two mottos have been over the years, together we can do it, and Ohio's motto, with God, all things are possible. Working together on a bipartisan basis, and with God's help, I'm positive that we can solve our problems, meet our challenges, and take advantage of the opportunities before us. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent for 5 minutes to speak on the judicial